Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon His messenger, His family, and those who follow him. My name is Bhawana Mishra. Just brief introduction. Born and raised in the Bay Area, went to college here, went to grad school here, sort of didn't leave here at all, except for a few years in Egypt. Currently I teach philosophy at Evergreen Community College in San Jose, which is why I was invited to give this talk entitled, "What is Islamic Philosophy?" I want to start with a hadith, which is a dua that the Prophet ﷺ used to make, and many of you are probably familiar with it. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa, wa min qalbin la yakhsha, wa min nafsin la tashba', wa min da'watin la yustajabu laha. O Allah, I seek refuge in you from knowledge which does not benefit, a heart that does not fear Allah, from a soul that is not satisfied, and the supplication that is not answered. And I start with this because I think it's very relevant to the field of philosophy. I don't know what impressions you have of philosophy, but it often seems to fall under that category of knowledge that does not benefit. A lot of debates and conversations about topics that seem completely irrelevant. This is not how I like to approach philosophy or teach philosophy or study philosophy, and it'll also probably not be the way we talk about philosophy during today's talk. So the title of the talk, which is "What is Islamic Philosophy?" I'm going to address in a different way. In what is philosophy and how is it relevant to me as a Muslim? So I am, like I said, I am a teacher, and I'm used to asking questions of my students. So those of you who are here in person, you're kind of on the spot a little bit. So I'm going to ask, and if you don't know, it's okay, but what do you think of when you think of philosophy, or how would you define philosophy? Or what are some of the things that come to mind when you think of philosophy? Anything? Yeah.
I feel like for me it's the ancient Greeks.
Yeah. Ancient, right. Yeah, ancient Greeks, Greek philosophy, Socrates, Aristotle, those guys, right? Yeah, and actually, if a really good experiment on this is if you were to type into like an AI image generator or something, like show me a picture of a philosopher, you will see someone who looks like Socrates or Aristotle, like old white man with a beard, right? Yeah, anything else that comes to mind when it comes to philosophy? Yeah. Yeah. What are the reasons why things happen? Like, these are exactly the kinds of questions that are asked in philosophy. So that and more. We'll talk about how philosophy can be defined. But actually a good way to define it is also by looking at the word itself. So philosophy comes from the ancient Greek, phil, and the root words are phil and sophia. And phil means love, so you probably know words like bibliophile or anglophile. Bibliophile, someone who loves books, or anglophile, someone who loves English culture, like Jane Austen, things like that. Or Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And then sophia means wisdom. So the word philosophy comes from the ancient Greek of love of wisdom. And honestly, it's a very basic but a pretty good definition of what philosophy is. There are two ways to approach the study of philosophy. One way is to study it historically in like an academic subject where you go through the history of philosophy in different civilizations, you talk about the philosophers, you talk about their ideas, you memorize these things. The other way to approach it is by considering philosophy a human activity and really a methodology. So, when I teach the first day of class, what I tell my students is, so at my college, two of the big programs are nursing and automotive. So I say, if you were in a nursing class or an automotive class, by the end of your time here at the college, what will you have hoped to learn? And it's not usually, I hope I memorize all the contents of my textbooks, or I memorize all the car manuals, or I memorize this and memorize that. The focus is really on skills, right? If a nurse comes to a patient and the patient is ailing with something, they want to know how to address it. Or a mechanic comes to a car, they want to know how to diagnose the problem, how to fix it. So it's in the doing, it's in the action, it's in gaining skills. And I tell my students that with philosophy, I think it's the same, that the benefit of studying philosophy, the way philosophy should be studied, is that you're gaining certain skills, not necessarily memorizing a bunch of facts and people and dates and things like that. So that will also be the way in which we talk about philosophy today. So if there are a couple of definitions of philosophy that I like because they point out some of the key aspects of philosophy. One way to define philosophy is the practice of philosophy is characterized by several general features. It is a form of rational inquiry, it aims to be systematic, and it tends to critically reflect on its own methods and presuppositions. It requires attentively thinking long and carefully about the provocative, vexing, and enduring problems central to the human condition. So I want to point out a few things in this definition. One, it starts off by saying the practice of philosophy. So it's something you do, okay? Also, that some of the key features is that there's rational inquiry, systematic. It also reflects on its own methods and presuppositions, meaning that it's always, when someone is doing philosophy, they're also always checking if they're doing the right thing, if they're thinking about things in the right way, if maybe they're making mistakes in their logic. So it's self-critical or self-reflecting, also systematic. And then also, I want to point out something that our sister pointed to, is that the focus of the attention is these big questions in life. Right? It can be, why do things happen the way they do in life? It could be, what's my purpose? What's the right way to live? What's the right way to be in a community together? Right? Like big questions that we think about. There's another definition which I think is also useful. It says the philosophical pursuit of wisdom involves asking general and fundamental questions. This is similar to what we just talked about. It often does not result in straightforward answers, but may help a person to better understand the topic, examine their life, dispel confusion, and overcome prejudices and self-deceptive ideas associated with common sense. So I like this also because I sometimes say that my job is so nice because I just have to ask questions. I don't know any answers, right? And philosophy is sometimes like that. You don't actually get to an answer, but the process itself is really important. The process of taking a topic. So when when I teach ethics, for example, I tell my students, I'm never going to tell you what to think, but we're going to learn how to think about a certain topic, right? So we look at the topic. One of the things the students do is they compare like alcohol and cocaine, and they think, they examine like what are the health effects of alcohol and cocaine, and what are the violence that results from using each of these things and whatever. And at the end of it, they're like, I wonder why alcohol's not illegal. Like, why is cocaine illegal and alcohol isn't illegal, right? And they see that there's not really a consistency in this. But it's just a process of examining the subject, taking away your prejudices, looking at the facts, and then thinking about it systematically and methodically, and coming up with maybe an answer, but at least a better understanding of a situation. And so, this last part of the definition, to help a person better understand the topic, examine their life, dispel confusion, and overcome prejudices. These are some of the benefits of engaging in philosophy. So philosophy, I feel, when we think about philosophy in this way, as a human activity and as a methodology, it really starts when someone's a child. Children ask questions all the time, right? And sometimes it gets like annoying for parents, because the kid is like, why? But kids are natural philosophers. They just want to find out about the world. So some of the questions they ask, Like, why is the sky blue? Why does the sun move across the sky? Why do I get sleepy? Why do I have to sleep, right? All these questions we might think of as also falling in the realm of science, but it's really the same type of question where we're trying to methodically come up with an answer to something that we observe in our life. Children also engage in basic logic. So logic is one of the categories of philosophy. And kids will naturally engage in this. I remember when my daughter was like 3, we were at a playground, and she was walking around the border, this wooden border of the playground, and she came and stopped because there was a pile of rocks that were arranged in this perfect like pyramid. And she looked at it and she said, "Mommy, who made this?" And I was thinking, subhanAllah, like she didn't see anyone make it, but she was able to figure out that because it's so perfectly built, it could not have been an accident, right? It couldn't have just been like somebody kicked a bunch of rocks and they just fell perfect. And I remember thinking at that time that this is actually like one of the ways in which people try to demonstrate the existence of Allah, right? That the world is perfectly designed, our bodies and the way the solar system works, it's perfect. Someone must have designed it. And she was using similar logic. Like, this pile is so perfect, someone must have done it. It couldn't have been an accident. But this is also logic, and this is very natural. I think any kid would have said the same thing or thought the same thing, because this is a natural facility that we have as human beings, is to use logic. I also often think this, I mean, not with our children, but when children question, is Santa really real? Or Easter Bunny, like, that doesn't make sense. I don't know any rabbits that lay eggs, or eggs don't have chocolate, or how can this guy fly? You know, they're thinking logically, right? And the adults in their life, I mean, I'm not doubting their intention. They want them to have fun and whatever, but they're essentially lying to their children, and the children are questioning this. Like, this isn't logical, right? Children also ask ethical questions. So ethics is another category of philosophy. Things like, why can't I hit my brother or sister when they take my toy, right? Or why can't I lie? Or why should I respect? Like, why is it important to show respect? You know, they're asking these questions that are ethical in nature. Unfortunately, I feel a lot of times kids are asked to like stop asking questions, and I honestly feel and hope after this that others will also feel that this kind of questioning should really be encouraged, because it helps us not just as human beings, but also within our faith. I mean, there's a long history, which we will look at, of people using philosophy and questioning and reasoning to help understand and explain our faith and actually recognize the beauty of our faith. So this is, even though it can be tiresome, it's questioning, you know, this type of questioning should really be encouraged. And so it follows that since all people engage in this natural kind of questioning, all civilizations have as well. So definitely, when people think of philosophy, they think of ancient Greece, right? But philosophy existed in every civilization that ever existed, because they all had people, and people engaged in this kind of thinking. What happened, if you kind of look at the history of civilizations, is early and ancient civilizations often depended on storytelling to describe the world around them, right? So we think of ancient Greek or Roman mythology, that's now popularized by like Percy Jackson and stuff like that. But also ancient Hindu mythology, ancient indigenous mythology, you know, that make up stories to describe why things are happening in the world the way they are, right? So they'll describe a chariot carrying the sun across the sky, or the rain is, or thunder is because some god, lowercase g, is angry and throwing thunderbolts down, you know. So all civilizations depended on storytelling, and then at some point it shifted to, well, we don't, the stories are creative and fun, but we don't really think that's what's actually happening. And so people started questioning, like, do I really need to sacrifice this human to make this God happy so that we won't have a drought anymore? Does this really make sense, or might there be something else going on, right? And so civilization slowly started to turn to reason and inquiry. And this was the beginning of philosophy, science. And like I said, this happened in every civilization at some point. And it happened differently in different places. There were some hot spots of philosophy. Greece was one of them because it was a place that was a crossroads for a lot of trade routes. So, you know, in ancient times when you'd have these caravans taking goods back and forth, Greece was like on the water, so ships would come, you know, people would come by road, and when you're exposed to a lot of ideas, it gets you thinking, right? Like, I have this story, but they have a different story, so which one is right? Or maybe it's not a story, maybe we need to come up with another reason, right? So it gets you thinking. Incidentally, this is also why later in the Islamic world there was so much science and learning, because the Islamic world also came in contact, it spread so far that it encompassed the ideas and thoughts and knowledge of so many other civilizations. So the Chinese, Indians, Persians, of course the Arabs, and then Europe and North Africa and Western Europe, right, Spain. So many ideas, and it led to this flourishing, which is also why I think the Bay Area is also such an innovative place, right? You have so much immigration and different kinds of people. Anyway, so eventually you started, people started turning to philosophy and reason and thinking in order to understand the world around them. I want to mention a couple of things before we move on about how I came in contact with philosophy before actually studying philosophy formally, because I think it's interesting to see the interplay of that and Islam. So I wasn't raised in a Muslim family, I was raised in a Hindu family, and when I was in college is when I really started to question religion and faith. It's a time where kids anyways are trying to think, like, what do I believe separate from what my parents believe, and my faith in Hinduism was always more cultural, and more like a philosophy of life rather than a religion of what I should do and what I shouldn't do. So I got to college and I started thinking about religion generally, and I remember thinking that, you know, if I were to, and this is how I thought at that time, if I were to make a religion, right, if I were to like create one, a religion should be one where you can be fully in the world and get married and have children and do a job and all that, but you could also be perfectly religious and committed to God and spiritual, and there's no conflict between the two. In a lot of like quote-unquote Eastern religions, there's a conflict between being in the world and being spiritual. So the sort of highest aspiration is you leave the world and you go into a forest and you meditate and you become a monk, and that's the perfect religious person. And I remember thinking, but I want to be a religious person, but I don't want to leave the world. Like, I want to have kids, I want to get married, and then when I started studying Islam, I was like, oh, wow, this is exactly how I imagined a religion should be, that you can be in the world but not of the world, right? Not attached to the world, but you can still engage in all the things. Other things, like I remember thinking, a religion, you know, should be in favor of the environment, for example, and I found that in Islam, and should be for social justice, and I found that in Islam. So everything I thought should be in a religion, I found in Islam. So that was sort of, I thought, wow, this is just a reasonable religion. And then I was reading a book, and I found this person was explaining the different ways to understand what it means to be a Muslim. And one of the ways he described one could understand what being a Muslim means is, he said, God created the entire universe with laws. And some of these laws apply to all of us
and apply to nature and everything without us having any choice. And we call these the laws of nature. So gravity, magnetism, like capillary action, so like a flower can't choose whether or not to suck up water through the roots, right? Or a rock can't choose whether or not it's going to fall. These are just laws that everything has to obey, including humans, these laws of chemistry, physics, biology. Also included in the laws are these spiritual laws or religious laws, right? And this is Islam. And he said that, we don't have a choice about all these other laws, but we have a choice about Islam. And if we choose to obey those laws, then what we're doing is we're choosing to become in harmony with the entire universe. That the entire universe is already Muslim because they're submitting to the laws of Allah. They didn't have a choice, but they're still doing it. So by that sense, they're Muslim, right? And we say this all the time to kids, that the trees are Muslim, the animals are Muslim, right? Because they're following what Allah wants them to do. But we have a choice about whether or not we want to do it. And if we do it, then instead of thinking of it as like we're doing something that's unnatural or hard or difficult, he said, by being a Muslim, you're putting yourself in harmony with the rest of the universe. And I thought that was such a beautiful way to think about what it means to be a Muslim. Like, it's a very natural state of being, right? That you're just like the trees and the animals, and you're just following what Allah wants. So these were like my first introductions to how philosophy can be used to understand Islam and appreciate Islam. It wasn't until later, after I became Muslim and then after I got married, my husband and I went to Cairo to study Arabic and Islamic studies, and I took, we had lots of classes we had to take. We took a class in Islamic philosophy, and I was like, oh, wow, I realized, okay, there were people who were fully committed to their faith, fully committed to Islam, but also were really interested in understanding the world in this interesting, rational, methodical way. And they used philosophy to help understand their faith better and explain better. And we'll talk about some examples. And I was also, I won't spend too much time on this, but I became very interested in Islamic legal philosophy and the idea of maqasid al-sharia. Are any of you familiar with this idea of the maqasid al-sharia? It's a really interesting concept. It's so interesting that I will spend a couple minutes on it. Basically, what the scholars did was they looked at all the things within Islam, like you're supposed to pray and you're fast and like the pillars, right? But then also all the other stuff that we're supposed to do or not do, and just the principles and ideals of Islam. And it says, and they said that there seems to be, first of all, everything seems to be geared towards wanting good and benefit for human beings. That everything asked of us is only for benefit. That it's not for harm. Harm is never supposed to come to us. And even things, like when I give talks on Ramadan, like at my local library, people always ask about the exceptions, right? And I say there are exceptions to fasting, because in Islam, there's never harm willed upon somebody, right? So it's supposed to be difficult, you're supposed to strive, but if fasting will harm somebody, like elderly or sick or whatever, they're not supposed to do it, because Islam doesn't want harm. So scholars saw this, that everything in Islam is for people's benefit. And then they also said specifically, it looks like there's 5 overarching goals of Islam. The maqasid, the sharia, maqasid means goals. So the goals of Sharia, or the goals of the law, and there's 5 of them, and it's to preserve the deen itself, the religion, Islam, and then to preserve life, preserve reason, preserve money or property, and to preserve lineage. And they said everything in Islam is for one of these goals. And I thought it was just so fascinating that these scholars were like looking at all the hadith and all the Quran, and they kind of reverse engineered this thing and said, oh, these are the 5 goals it seems like Islam is geared towards. And then it was used later not only to understand Islam, but also to come up with new rulings. So if you came across a new substance, is the substance halal or haram? Well, let's look at these things. Cigarettes damage your life, and they damage your reason, because they make you, not think properly or get you a little high. So it's like against 2 of these 5 goals, and it wastes money or something. I don't know what else you could, come up with. So therefore it's not allowed, right? Or they come up with some other situation and say, in the context of this is it. So anyways, I became very fascinated with the subject, Islamic legal philosophy, but because my bachelor's was in chemistry, I had to get a master's in philosophy first. I couldn't go straight for a PhD. So I did my master's, I started teaching, and then I just fell in love with teaching. So I never went back for my PhD. But while I was studying philosophy for my master's degree, I also realized that there were so many things within Western philosophy, because all the programs here are Western philosophy, right? So that's who you study, that's the standard. And while I'm talking, I'll point out some of these similarities. I'll give you one example right now. One of the classes I took was on Kant, Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher who talked about a lot of different things. But when we were studying his ethical theory, he said the moral worth of an act is not dependent on the consequences, but on the intention with which you do the act. So a good intention means it's a good act, a bad intention means it's a bad act. And I'm sitting here, I just got back from Egypt, I just finished doing this Islamic studies thing, and still pretty new Muslim, and I hear this, and what do you think I thought of first? Say again? Yeah, the first hadith in Hadith Nawawi, right, the famous 40 hadith, is actions are but by their intentions, right? And so for the next, it took me a while to finish my program because I had a baby and all that stuff, but for those few years, I remember so often I'd be sitting in class thinking, oh, but Islam already said that. Oh, Islam said that too. Oh, Islam said that too. Because, and you'll see later, some Islamic philosophers also thought that truth is truth. In Islam, we were given the truth through the Quran, Hadith, right? But if you were to think about things rationally, you would get to the same truth. It would just take longer, and it would be like harder to get there, right? So Kant spent his whole life coming up with a theory that's in like the first Hadith and Hadith Nawawi, right? But that's what Muslim philosophers thought, that you would come to the same truth from both directions. And so there's a role for philosophy in understanding Islam. Okay, so I want to talk about a few things before we talk about like specific Muslim philosophers and periods in Islamic history. I want to talk about the role that philosophical methodology can play in Islam, and we already talked about this a little bit. So one benefit of studying philosophy for the Muslim is to understand rulings within Islam. I think one of the earliest and easiest examples of this is the example of when the Prophet ﷺ told a group of his companions, do not pray Asr until you arrive at Bani Qurayza. Right? So there is, maybe you've heard of this, have you heard this hadith maybe? So there was a group traveling to this Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza, and he tells them, do not pray Asr until you get there. So this group of companions is going, and in the middle of their trip, it becomes Asr time. And so half of them say, okay, but the Prophet ﷺ told us not to pray until we arrive at that tribe. So we're not going to pray. He very clearly said, don't pray until you get there. And then the other half were saying, no, he didn't literally mean that. He was just encouraging us to hurry so that we can get there by Asr time, right? So sort of take it metaphorically. So half of them prayed, and half of them like prayed then and there because it was Asr time, and then the other half waited and followed the Prophet's logic literally. Later, after they returned to the Prophet ﷺ, they told him about what happened. Does anyone here know like what was his response to this group when they told him? Who do you think was right? Yeah. He said you're both right. And he didn't say this group was better, that group was better, they were right, they were wrong. He said you both were correct and you both did the correct thing. I think this is such an important incident from the life of the Prophet ﷺ because it affirms that you can have multiple valid opinions about things in Islam. It also shows you that people have like natural tendencies and how they interpret things in Islam, right? And this is just sort of, some people tend to take things literally, some people tend to take things metaphorically, and this happened here, and the Prophet ﷺ said both were fine. But the key was that they both gave their reasons for why they wanted to do what they did, right? And they both groups applied some sort of logic. One was like, we should take it literally, and the other said we should look at overall what's the essence of Islam and what's the, what is wanted of us, and let's interpret this in conformity with everything else that we know about Islam, right? They were both methodologies, but they were methodologies, right? They were ways of approaching. So philosophy and thinking about things in a methodical way help us understand rulings, and this was sort of a precursor to all the Islamic sciences. For anyone who studied anything about the Islamic sciences, there's a methodology to understanding Quran, there's a methodology to understanding Hadith, there's a methodology for understanding like how to reconcile between maybe an ayah and a hadith that seem like they're saying different things. I mean, like when we did our Islamic studies program, we studied 19 subjects. I didn't even know there were 19 different topics in Islamic studies you could study, but you can. And this was just like the tip of the iceberg. It was a very short, small program. So, we have in our scholarship developed all these methodologies to understanding our religion. These are all philosophical methods. These are all, a methodical approach. So philosophical methodology is important to understanding rulings and also to determine new rulings. So like I mentioned before, we'll come across topics that are maybe new and we don't know how to deal with them, right? So now there's a lot of talk about how do we deal with the issue of like transgender identity and what are the rulings. This is actually not totally new. There's some precedent in our Islamic history about with people who are intersex or even transgender, and there's some references we can go back to help understand this issue, but in the scope and scale that it is today, it's a new thing. So how do you understand this, right? And you can't just base it on what I feel. Like, I feel this is weird, or I feel it's okay. Like, you have to have some basis and methodology for figuring out, like, what's the, like, Islamic stance on it in terms of fiqh. But then that's also different from, but then how do we deal with people in society, right? So, like, the worst thing you can do in Islam is kufr, right? And we're dealing with people all the time who engage in kufr, right? So there's a difference between like the stance on a particular action and then also how you're dealing with it. How do we deal with it legally, for example, how we deal with socially in our schools and whatever, right? So all this takes methodology, it takes wisdom, it takes knowledge. One of the methodologies that the scholars came up with very early is this methodology of qiyas. And qiyas means where you take some new situation but apply the methodology or ruling of a similar other situation onto this new one, right? So I mentioned before smoking, you could say it's similar to like alcohol, and so maybe whatever we say for alcohol you can apply to smoking, or something similar. This is called qiyas, and it's very similar to modern day, like in courts, they appeal to precedent, right? It's the same thing. Another way that philosophical methods and thinking can help is actually to, aside from rulings, like understanding or coming up with new rulings, is just to have a better, deeper understanding of just concepts within the religion. So last year I gave a talk, I was asked to give a talk on shukr, or gratitude. And for some reason, I think I was listening to somebody else give a talk on the names of Allah, and one of the names of Allah is Ash-Shakur, right? And I was thinking, so that came to mind when I was preparing for this talk, and I was thinking, that's a sort of a strange name for Allah, because when we think of shukr, when we think of the English word gratitude, it's like you're thanking somebody for doing something for you, and you appreciate it, right? But we can't do anything for Allah. Like what can we do for Allah? Nothing, right? So why would Allah be thanking, right? So then I thought, okay, the English is clearly failing us here, right? So let's go back to the Arabic. So I went back to the Arabic and looked up the meaning of shukr, the root, like the root of it. And the root comes from the same word to like break open some earth and cultivate a plant, like get a plant to grow. Like you water and feed and whatever, and you break open the earth so that it can have an easier way to grow. So it's like taking something that has potential and feeding it so that it grows bigger and better. And that's actually the meaning of shukr, is to like recognize something good and then feed it or acknowledge it. So when we say, even between humans, gratitude, it's more like I saw that you did something nice and I'm acknowledging that you did something nice. And so for Allah, shakur is Allah recognizes in us the things that we do good and rewards us for it, and not ignores, but doesn't put as much weight on the bad things we do, right? So acknowledges the good more than the bad, right? Reward us more for the good deeds, like tenfold, hundredfold, and just punish us one time for the sin. Anyway, the other interesting thing about this, I know this isn't the topic, but the other interesting thing about shukr is in the Quran, shukr and kufr are always put as opposites. The opposite of kufr, which is disbelief, in the Quran isn't iman or belief, it's shukr, which is interesting, right? That why would the opposite of disbelief or kufr be gratitude? And then it makes sense in the context that, well, if you recognize the good of Allah, then of course you're going to believe in Allah. But also, the root Arabic words are opposites. So you probably know that kufr means to cover something up. So it's like when farmers would cover up something. And shukr is when they would open up something. So I was like, this is amazing, right? That the words themselves are opposites and the meanings in Islam are opposites. But you wouldn't know this unless you delved into like, what is the meaning of the word? What is, like, methodically going through these actions, right? So thinking philosophically, thinking in this way can also help uncover the beauty of Islam and concepts, like hidden meanings to the Quran or Islam that we didn't realize were there, right? Until you started looking deeper. It can also help us understand just general situations, and I want to give another example that I think is really important, which is like when I was a new Muslim, I know this masjid has, mashallah, a pretty robust new Muslim program. When I became Muslim, we didn't have a big program, but there was a class that I would go to, a new Muslim class. And I sort of refer to myself as a stealth convert because I'm brown and I'm like desi, like Indian background, so people don't realize I'm a convert. But everyone else in the class was white and kind of stood out in the masjid, and so people would would all the time go up to them and think that they can tell them what to do and how to practice and whatever. And they had like awful stories. I mean, one of the brothers, he said he was praying and some guy came and changed, like was trying to turn his foot in the proper position for prayer, but like it hurts and he couldn't do it. And it was like, he was in the middle of prayer and he was like doing this. And then, you know, sisters of course always get told like hijab and nail polish and this and that, and right? Like all these things. And unfortunately, I think out of the 6 of us, like 4 of them left Islam. They're like, this is too hard. Like people, like I can't deal with this. This is too hard. Unfortunately, subhanAllah. And I was protected by Allah, but also protected that I wasn't subject to that because people didn't know I was a convert. Anyways, so what can philosophy do? Philosophy can help you understand what are the priorities in Islam, right? Someone is coming to pray, let them pray. Like it's fine, like yes, okay, we can talk about all the rulings about nail polish or hijab or your foot or whatever, the length of your pants or whatever, all these details, right? But they're just details, right? The core is belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, belief in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and some fundamental practices that we want people to work on, right? Like praying, like, you know, or having a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the other stuff comes, even the companions had 23 years to like figure it out, right? Or longer. And a lot of them still drank and still fornicated and still did all these things that they weren't supposed to do. So philosophy can help you, and there's actually a branch of Islamic studies called fiqh al-awlawiyat, like the fiqh of priorities, figuring out what are the priorities that we should be focusing on, like the order, right? So go in order, and nail polish is like down here, right? Or the exact position of your foot is down here. Anyway, so that's another way how philosophy can be useful. Okay, so now, in the interest of time, I want to move to talk about some of the, so I said there's 2 ways to study philosophy. One is as a human activity, as a methodology, and then the history of philosophy. I am going to do a little bit of the history of philosophy because just so that you can hear some names and know that we have this rich history of people who are engaged in philosophy. So I'm going to do that, but while I do that, I'll also talk a little bit about what was the significance of the philosophy that these people did. So of course, the very beginning of Islamic philosophy was right after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, so like the 7th and 8th centuries. And people started using philosophical methods to understand the Quran and to defend Islamic beliefs. So just like we talked about before, there were rulings, people didn't know what to do about it, or Quran, they didn't know how to interpret it. So they started using these kinds of philosophical methods. So a lot of the works at that time were really focused on understanding Islam. So there's like the Kitab al-Tawheed, which means the book of divine unity. So explaining why it is that Allah is just one, and how do we know this, and what does it mean that Allah is only one, right? So really explaining the basics of Islam. That was really the focus. There was also, so many of you may have heard of this group, the Mu'tazila. It's like this early group of Muslims who came out of this conflict about whether Ali or Uthman radiallahu anhuma would be the new Khalifa, right? So the Shia Sunni thing. So it came out of that. But then they became, sure, this philosophical group that just did, not just, but they did intellectual work, not just like this political, not just having political opinions. And they did, I'll give you an example of what they said. So there was this question of whether ayahs from the Quran should be interpreted literally or metaphorically, right? And what they said in one of the books of one of the people from this group, his name is Abdul Jabbar, he said, if a verse can be interpreted literally and it doesn't conflict with anything else in the Quran or Hadith or in the spirit of Islam, then you must interpret it literally, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose these words not it's not like there was no reason for these words, right? Allah chose the words specifically, so you have to take it literally. But if interpreting it literally leads to some sort of conflict, or some confusion. So for example, in the Quran, when it describes the hand of God, right? And we often talk about, and we'll tell kids when they're reading, like, no, we don't, it doesn't mean the actual, like, literal hand, not like our hand, right? It means, it's metaphorical, it means the power of Allah, right? When we say the hand of Allah. So the Mu'tazila said, if interpreting it literally causes some sort of contradiction, then you're allowed to interpret it metaphorically, but still like as close as possible to the literal meaning, as you know. So there's other examples that could also make that that could make that clear. But this is one example. So this is, now as I say this, it might be very obvious to you, right? You might be like, okay, obviously that's what you're supposed to do. But it's because all these philosophers talked about these things that it became part of our understanding that this is how we should be interpreting the Quran and stuff, right? It seems, yeah, obviously, but it wasn't necessarily obvious in the beginning, right, until these philosophers did that work. The next couple of centuries, like the 8th and 9th centuries, this was a time where, if you think about what's happening historically to the Muslim world, they're expanding, right? The first couple centuries was still sort of localized in the like Arabian Peninsula and around there, but then there's rapid growth. So again, they're discovering other civilizations, other ideas. And so this was a time where there was a lot of translation from Greek, the Greek knowledge into Arabic. And I want to mention here one thing that's important that happened much later, but it's related to this. You may or may not know, like when we talk about the European Dark Ages, it was this time in Europe where there was like no learning, not none, but there was very little learning. Health was very bad. People were dying. There was lots of fighting and wars. There was no philosophy, you know, no science. And a lot of that was because the church wanted to maintain its power, and it saw science and philosophy and learning as a threat. Because science and philosophy were discovering things that were going against the church position. So one example is the church said that the earth was the center of the universe. Then Galileo used his, you know, equipment, and he said, actually it looks like the planets are circling around the sun. It looks like we're going around the sun. We're not the center of the universe. The sun is the center. Well, this contradicted the church. He was arrested, and they said, you can't say this, you know. So this is like an example of what was happening in Europe. In the Muslim world, we know that while there were maybe certain people who opposed some science, there was never this kind of big opposition to science in Islam, in the Muslim world. So they themselves completely forgot Aristotle, the Muslim world. So they themselves completely forgot Aristotle. And then they got all of Aristotle's philosophy from the Muslims. And they got it in Arabic, and what they also got, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with like Arabic books, but often you'll have like the text of a book, and then on the edges you'll have all this commentary, like footnotes, right? Just like we have in any other kind of book. So when Europe got the philosophy back, they didn't just get the text, they got all the commentary. So a lot of like Christian philosophy, Catholic philosophy, a lot of it is so similar to Islamic philosophy because they learned, like, oh, this is how they dealt with this religious issue. Maybe we can apply that too. So Aquinas, who's like a Catholic philosopher who's considered like almost the hero of Catholicism, he helped explain Catholicism to Catholics and make it understandable and accessible to everybody. All of his so many of his ideas are just like Ibn Rushd or Ibn Sina or all these Muslim philosophers because they read them. They had to read what they said. So this period of translation is really important because then centuries later it set up Europe's Renaissance, right, and coming back into all this learning. So that's really important. Okay, Then after that, we get to the 9th and 10th centuries. So at this point, there's still translation going on, but also now that you can imagine what's happening, now that they have this philosophy, they're trying to think, well, we have philosophy, but we also have Islam. So who's right? Aristotle or the Quran? Plato or Allah, right? And they're trying to figure these things out. Generally, throughout the history of philosophy in the Muslim world, Muslim philosophers think both can be correct, and you'll see this theme throughout. One example of a philosopher from this period of time is, his name is Al-Kindi. You maybe have heard this name. He was a philosopher, he was a mathematician, he was a physician. He was also a music theorist, which I thought was really interesting. You know, in the Islamic world, they had like psychological or mental health wards, like hospitals for people suffering from mental illness. And they used things like color therapy, music therapy, animal therapy, things that seem new and innovative now were being used then, which is so interesting. So anyways, Al-Kindi was also a music theorist. And he said something interesting. He said that prophecy and philosophy are two different roads to arrive at the same truth. And he said, but prophecy has a few advantages. He said with philosophy, you know, the philosopher has to go through a long period of training and study and, you know, school, university, all this stuff to become a philosopher. Whereas for prophecy, Allah just confers it upon somebody, right? I mean, you think about the Prophet ﷺ, who was unlettered, and I mean, of course, he was a good man, the best of men, but the prophecy was conferred on him. It didn't take all the study and all that. Secondly, he says the philosopher must arrive at truth by his own devices with great difficulty, whereas the prophet has the truth revealed to him by God. So the philosopher, after studying, then they have to figure out what's right and what's wrong. And, you know, like I mentioned, Immanuel Kant came up with his theory of intention, right? So after so long, right? But prophets are given the truth. He said, thirdly, the understanding of the prophet, because it's divinely revealed, is more clear and comprehensive than that of the philosopher. So a prophet will perfectly understand the truth because, again, it's given divinely, whereas a philosopher, they may come to the truth, but it's not so clear, there may not be a complete understanding. And then fourthly, the prophet is able to express this understanding to ordinary people very easily, whereas a philosopher can't do it so easily. I don't know how many of you have tried to study philosophy or taken a philosophy class, but often philosophers are like, what? Like, what is this person saying, right? And then you think about the Prophet ﷺ and his hadith, like this was one of his miracles, is that he was able to say so much with so few words, right? Very clear and very profound, could convey a lot of meaning without books and books like philosophers are trying to produce. So Al-Kindi, this philosopher, said, yeah, philosophers and prophets will come to the same thing, but philosophers, it's just harder, and it takes a long time, and they can't express it as clearly as prophets. So prophets are more reliable, right? So depend on the Quran, the Hadith, but there's nothing wrong with philosophy, you know? You see how he was trying to say it's okay to do both, or philosophy's okay. Okay, then we move to the next couple centuries, 10th, 11th centuries, and this was really the peak of the golden age of Islam. When we talk to our kids, or we tell people like, oh, did you know Muslims invented algebra and trigonometry, and they named all these stars and came up with this, right? The golden age, this is when it was happening. So lots of science, lots of philosophy. One of the philosophers at that time was named Ibn Sina, who in Europe became known as Avicenna, so A-V-I-C-E-N-N-A, but in Arabic was Ibn Sina. He was a philosopher, but also he was a physician, and actually the book he wrote called The Canon of Medicine was used as the medical textbook in Europe for centuries and centuries. So he wrote the book that the Europeans were studying for medicine. He wrote this really interesting thought experiment called the floating man. And what he said, what Ibn Sina said when he's describing this, he says, imagine, so a thought experiment is something that philosophers do to try to figure out something. They'll do an experiment, but it's just through thinking, right, instead of like a physical experiment. So Ibn Sina said, what if we imagine a person falling through the sky or floating and can't feel or see anything, can't even feel their own body. So in modern context, maybe like a sensory deprivation chamber or something, right? Can't see anything, can't feel anything. He says, would the person still know that they exist if they can't see anything or feel anything? And then he says, well, the person would still be thinking and would be thinking like, do I exist? And by thinking would know that he exists. Like somebody must be doing this thinking. So I must exist. And he says, therefore, the core of this person's existence is like their soul or their mind, right? Not necessarily the body. This is really interesting. I know it sounds weird, but it's also very interesting because this is almost exactly what Descartes said like 500 years later. René Descartes was a French philosopher who many people have heard of him, but you've probably also heard his famous line, I think, therefore I am, right? And I think, therefore I am is like exactly this thing. René Descartes, again, like 500 years later in France, is like, I can't really trust, he did it a little bit differently. He says, I can't trust my sensory data, but like, I can be tricked, right? And we all know sometimes we see optical illusions, or you hear something that's not really there, or you feel something that's not really there. So he says our senses are pretty unreliable. So really all you can depend on is your mind. And even sometimes your mind can play tricks on you, but at least you know you're thinking. Even if you don't know if what you're thinking is correct, at least you know you're thinking. Therefore, I must exist. I think, therefore I am. And this is like what Ibn Sina said like 100 years before. Anyway, so this is an example of like, at that time people were immersed in science and learning, but then also coming up with these thought experiments and philosophy. And then the next period, and I think this is the last, I'll move on to something else after this, but the next period has two of these superstars in Islamic philosophy. Imam al-Ghazali, who like everybody knows, yeah, from his Ihya Ulum ad-Din, but also so much other work. And then Ibn Rushd, who in Europe became known as Averroes, and you might be familiar, there's a high school, Muslim high school in Fremont named Averroes, named after Ibn Rushd. So these two superstar philosophers. I'll give you an example of each of their philosophy. First of all, Al-Ghazali wrote this book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, which means the incoherence of the philosophers. It was sort of attacking philosophy, but he really was just attacking a particular group of philosophers who really prioritized philosophy over Islam. So they were like so obsessed with the philosophy of Aristotle, Plato, that even if the philosophy contradicted Islam, they preferred the philosophy over Islam. So he was sort of saying that's not correct. But he didn't really have a big problem with the rest of philosophy, and even his own work was philosophical in nature. So Ibn Rushd wrote a reply. The book was called Tahafut at-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, basically like a rebuttal to Al-Ghazali, saying, no, Al-Ghazali, you actually like a lot of the philosophy, and it actually, you agree with a lot of it, and it's not all that bad. Let me give you an example though of one, aside from this like Tahafut battle, something that each of them said which was very interesting. Al-Ghazali, he said something that has to do with cause and effect. He says that we see things happen next to like right after each other, so we think one thing caused the other. So we'll see a fire next to a piece of cotton, and then we'll see the cotton burn. So we think the fire burned the cotton. But what Al-Ghazali said is that the fire was not the cause of the burning. Allah is the cause of the burning. These are just things that happen in the world that we see next to each other, so we think that one is the cause of the other, but it's really Allah is the cause. And what's the example that we can use is Ibrahim alayhi salam. So when Ibrahim alayhi salam was talking to his family and telling them, you know, to be Muslim, and this doesn't make sense, and why are you worshiping the idols? And then they throw him into the fire, and Allah told the fire to be cool, right? So according to the laws of the world, fire burns. If the fire is there, burning should happen. But Al-Ghazali argues, but the fire isn't the cause, Allah is the cause. So if Allah wants, Allah can cause the fire not to burn, and it can be cool, and it won't burn. And this is the nature of all miracles, right? That if you understand that the cause is really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the normal ways of the world don't necessarily have to happen the way that we expect them to happen. What I think is interesting about this also is David Hume, who was a Scottish philosopher in the 17th century, so again, 400 or 500 years later, he said the exact same thing, that not about Allah, and never actually said what is the cause, but said just because you see things happening a certain way doesn't mean they're going to continue to happen that way. That's just what you're used to. And this became known as the problem of induction, which we won't get too much into, but this is why, for example, science can sometimes be wrong. This doesn't mean that science is bad, but that's why things will change, right? Like eggs are bad, and then, oh, eggs are good for you. Or fat is bad for you, oh, fat is good for you. Or certain theories about the model of the atom, or like quantum mechanics, things like that. Things keep changing in science because we observe things and we expect them to be a certain way, but we could have been wrong, right? So then our observations could have been wrong, and they won't necessarily be that way in the future. Anyway, so this is something that Al-Ghazali said, philosophical in nature, but in a way that explains things within Islam and includes Islam. I'll give one quick example of something Ibn Rushd said. I mean, he said, he's actually one of the most prolific Islamic philosophers, and you could actually do you could spend your whole life studying his philosophy. But his main purpose in his philosophy was to show that there was a harmony between Islam and philosophy. And he was known for his work on Aristotle's philosophy. So Aristotle said something that all human beings really just want happiness. So they might think they want a car, or they want marriage, or they want money, or they want to be famous, but they really want all of those things because they want happiness. Because if they were to get one of those things and it made them unhappy, they wouldn't want it anymore, right? If they wanted to be famous, they became famous, and now they hate it, they say, oh, I wish I weren't famous. So it wasn't really fame they wanted the happiness they thought they would get from the fame. So Aristotle says really everyone just wants happiness, and that's the ultimate thing that people are striving for. And Ibn Rushd commented on this, and he said in Islam it's the same thing. What we really want is eternal happiness. And everything we're working on in this world is really in order to gain that, right? So there's no use in like debating like all these, he would say sometimes people get in these arguments about Jannah, right? Like know exactly what is in Jannah, and you know, will I have this or will I have that? And he's like, it doesn't matter, it's Jannah. You're happy. You're just going to be happy, right? So he says all we're aiming for is happiness. So this is how he would like interpret Aristotle's philosophy and say, oh, Islam says, you know, the same thing, but in religious terms, whereas Aristotle is using philosophical terms. Okay. So I want to, in the interest of time, in case and in case there's a couple of questions, you know, after these centuries, there was still more philosophy, but there was a bit of a decline as you know, then the Muslim world started breaking up, and this sort of golden age left. They were still learning. They're still learning today. There are still Muslim philosophers today, obviously doing work. And the ones who are doing work now are sort of doing the same thing that those philosophers are doing back then. So there's examples of philosophers who are trying to figure out what would Islam say about communism, or what would Islam say about democracy, or what would Islam say about Muslims in the West, and how does that change how we practice our Islam, or the role of women in Islam, right? There's feminist Muslim philosophers now who are talking about nothing, like, some are controversial, some may say stuff that doesn't seem to be within the fold of Islam, but for the most part, they're trying to reclaim the role that women historically had in Islam and has been sort of covered up for a long time, right? So there's, like, Maryam Amir started an app, Qari'ah, which is about women reciters of the Quran, which is a flourishing thing in many parts of the world, but in other parts it's seen as like something that can't happen, or, right? So it discourages girls from memorizing Quran. So there's similarly philosophers who are trying to think about these issues and make sense of the modern world, and use philosophy to help make sense of Islam in the modern world. But I want to end with a couple things. One is, what do we need to be really careful about in terms of studying philosophy? Because when I mention people that I studied philosophy or I teach philosophy, sometimes the reaction I get is, oh, are you allowed to as a Muslim? Right? They're sometimes seen as like this philosophy can be really dangerous. And it can be, I think, if you don't already have a strong foundation in Islamic belief, and if you study things that are really kind of esoteric and impractical and don't really apply to your life, then you can get sort of caught up. If you have a tendency towards that, you can get caught up in that. So if you know that you're the kind of person who gets really caught up in like, or really involved and immersed in like intellectual debates that sometimes seem to be not very relevant to like your actual life, it might be good to be careful around philosophy, because it can suck you in, and you can start to think about things that again don't really have any practical effect and can confuse you. So you do have to be careful about that. I think we also have to be careful that while Islam honors our intellect, we shouldn't worship our intellect, right? We worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's an example of a group, actually right when I became Muslim, someone tried to like recruit me to this group, and they were all about, it was started by this man who thought he discovered the miracle of the Quran in the number 19. So he did like all these math things and said, oh, there's this magic number 19 in the Quran, if you add this ayah and add this surah and whatever, and he said this is why the Quran is true, because of the number 19. But in order to make it fit, he had to remove 2 ayahs from one of the surahs, right? So they even gave me their version of the book, and and I was like, this sounds weird. So I didn't get involved, and then later I found out like what this group is. But so this is like the danger of worshiping your intellect. You think you figured it out, so you think you're right with this number 19, so the Quran must have been wrong, so let's take these out, right? So you have to be careful that, and things like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that pork is haram, right? So it's haram. We can try to understand why, like, oh, it's dirty and pigs have parasites and whatever. But what if someone were to come to you with a completely clean, perfect pig that was raised like in their house, no issue, it would still be haram, right? So we shouldn't depend so much on like the reasons and the intellect that we think that supersedes what Allah said. If it's haram, it's haram. We can try to understand it, that's fine. But that shouldn't be the main reason why we obey, right? The main reason we obey is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said so. So these are some of the dangers. Another one I'll mention briefly is, remember that there are and so I don't think this is an issue for most people, but this is mostly aimed towards people who can really get involved in philosophy, that remember there are other aspects of our humanity that are important, other than just our reason and rational ability, right? Emotion is important. Sometimes it seems like there's this fight between reason and emotion, right? And it's like, come on, this is important. Don't be emotional. Just be rational. Just be reasonable. But emotion is important, right? I mean, I think if more people were emotional, they might do something about the genocide in Gaza, right? If more people were emotional, maybe we wouldn't go to war so easily, or maybe we would help more people, or maybe we would be more kind to people, right? I mean, there's a role for emotion. Rational thinking can sometimes justify awful things, right? You say, well, I'm going to bomb this city because I'm after these 3 people, and yeah, maybe hundreds of kids will die, but it's justified because these 3 people are so dangerous and they're collateral damage, right? This is how we justify wars. Or I can torture this person because they might give me information that will be useful, right? So the intellect can be used to justify awful things. So we also have to remember there's other parts of our humanity that's important. Our creativity, our emotion, things that aren't necessarily in the realm of philosophy. In conclusion, I think, based on what we talked about today, it is important to embrace our philosophical history, our tradition, learn and practice these different methods, but all with the intention of serving society, serving our faith, and feeding our own souls and bringing us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was really our legacy of Islamic philosophers, that they did so with the intention of serving Islam, serving their society, and bringing them closer to Allah. Anything of benefit I said today was from Allah. Anything I said wrong was my mistake. I ask you to forgive me. Jazakallah khairan for listening. Are there any questions? Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. I think we have like 10 minutes before Maghrib. Yeah. And we have or comments. We can just have a conversation. Oh.
It's not a question, but I want to tell you that since I was a little girl, my mom used to tell us that Rasulullah Sayyidina Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, his auntie was praying and her hair from the back is going down. Then one of the ladies there, he said, oh, tell her to stop. He said, shh, don't stop her of praying. Then all of them waited until she's done. When she's done, the ladies told him, oh, pray again, your hair was building. And the Rasul said, no, her prayer is accepted and no need to repeat it again. Yeah, this.
Yeah. So like wisdom and how you approach issues, right? As opposed to just being fixated on like the rules and the regular, like having some wisdom. And we know the example also when the Bedouin came and started urinating in the masjid, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, let him finish, and then explain that you can't do this. And
and I remember when I was a high school student, I took a philosophy class. I loved that teacher. All philosophy teachers are great, really. Yeah, every day she wanted to make us laugh at the beginning of the class. She said, okay, ضليت أصلي تنو حصلي لما حصلي بطلت أصلي. It means I kept praying until I got what I need. When I got it, I stopped praying.
Stop praying.
Yeah. And another one she makes also, she said, الغاية لا تبرر الوسيلة. It means the goal does not justify the means.
Yes.
And they said, okay, someone, he go steal something. He said, I want to give it to poor people. Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah. So all these things require, philosophical.
And thank you so much. It's a great session.
Thank you. Jazakallah khairan. I think she had a comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for sharing about the philosophy. I was just thinking about, the difference between philosophy and theology. Yeah, so, so you were like saying that philosophy can be confusing. And then, but might as well study theology, right? Because we focus on God, oneness.
Yeah.
It just came to my mind. So, do you have any response to that?
Theology, in a way, there's a lot of overlap between theology and philosophy, right? So you're applying the same kind of methods of philosophy, but the subject in theology is all concerning God and religion, and right? So in that way, it can be less, it can also be like strenuous, and you have to work hard at it, but it's not necessarily as confusing as philosophy. But then philosophy covers a lot of things that you don't always get in theology, and a lot of those things can be very beneficial. So, part of theology is ethics and somewhat logic and things like that. But in philosophy, you can study logic on its own, ethics on its own, and that can also be it can be very useful. I think for a Muslim, you just need to, at least the way I did it, like when I became Muslim, I became Muslim through certainty. I knew, I came to it willingly after being convinced, both intellectually but also spiritually, like it felt like this was the right thing. Intellectually, it made sense. So when I came to Islam, I didn't have a doubt that it was the truth, and that was the attitude with which I approached philosophy. So if something came up in philosophy in my classes that I didn't agree with, I kind of left it. I said, okay, that's what they think, but I know that that's not true. But I think if you don't go into it with that attitude, I'm not saying my belief was so great or I was so great, but if you don't approach it with that intention or that attitude, it can get dangerous. Especially, I've heard from people who just are drawn to that kind of activity, philosophy, and it can get very confusing, I won't mention some of the problems because I don't want people to get confused by me. But they could start thinking along these lines and say, well, does that make sense? Does Allah exist? Or what? How come all the religions aren't true? And maybe they are all true, and it can get confusing if you don't go at it with the right intention. Yeah. Oh yeah. 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 I know some of our scholars talk a lot about this, the challenges of postmodernism, where there's no truth or there's no standard, right? Anything can be right or wrong, or it's all flexible, and but ultimately it just doesn't make sense. Like certain things perhaps, yes, are flexible. Maybe in certain ways we've been too rigid, in certain ways we need to be more open-minded, but there can't so this is called like moral relativism or relativism, right? Where there is nothing right or wrong, but clearly there are things that are wrong, right? Like abusing a child, for example, is wrong. There's no way someone can justify and say, no, maybe this is good, and it's not. It's just wrong. So if there are some things that are wrong, then it can't be that everything is just flexible, right? There has to be some things that are right and wrong. Yeah. Good.
Sister, we got a few minutes here. There's questions on a live stream.
Oh.
Dean asking his questions. Why is the position of philosophy haughty, debated in Islamic theological circles? Some Muslims theologies are very pro-philosophy, and some big one too. View philosophy and logical as arm.
So I think
So the question about why is philosophy so hotly debated amongst Muslims, and some see it as good and some see it as harmful, is because of this thing that I sort of alluded to with Al-Ghazali, which is that some philosophers seem to almost start worshiping the intellect instead of worshiping Allah. So instead of using the intellect as a tool, and it's okay, I'm not saying like you have to, so this is tricky because I'm not necessarily saying you have to start thinking about something and not be open-minded about the different possibilities, and like you should be open-minded, you should consider different points of view and all that stuff. But if you start thinking that you yourself can come up with all the truth, you're not realizing your own human limitations in terms of knowledge. Even if you don't believe in God, even if someone doesn't believe in God, they should recognize that there's a limitation to human endeavor and human thought, right? And when they don't recognize that, and then especially as a Muslim, they can start thinking that what they have come up with is better, or especially if it contradicts Islam, then maybe Islam is wrong. And then that's why it can get confusing and it can be dangerous. But I think you can safeguard yourself against that. If you can safeguard yourself against that, realize as a human you have limitations, and start with a place of like yaqeen or some level of certainty in existence of Allah and the prophethood of the Prophet, then it shouldn't be dangerous. It can be something that can assist you in understanding and believing. Yeah.
There's a question, sister, here is online right now. We got a lot of questions here online.
Oh.
Sorry. What's the relation between philosophy and Sufism?
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other lecture.
Oh, okay, I know.
And honestly, one that I'm not really an expert on, but I mentioned, so there was a time where Sufism started becoming the focus of a lot of Muslim philosophers. So we know Imam al-Ghazali as a philosopher, as a scholar, but also many people associate him with Sufism and a lot of these writings that encouraged later Sufi movements. So I would say that it's one of the categories of Islamic philosophy, was exploring spirituality and Islam in that way, and sort of gave rise to Sufism. Yeah.
There's also questions, and I'm going to have a sister ask you. Should Muslims, laymen, get involved in philosophy, or should they get left it for scholars?
Should Muslims? I mean, I think there's certain...
Laymen's.
Yeah, I think there's certain skills that every person should have, not just every Muslim, but every person should have, that can be learned from philosophy. It's not like you have to pursue a degree or whatever, but just like basic methods of critical thinking, basic approaches to ethics. I think this is beneficial for all people. If you're going to be a citizen in a diverse, multicultural society where people have different opinions, you need to be able to navigate that. And I think critical thinking and the kinds of skills you learn through philosophy can help you navigate all those different issues. Yeah. Yes. Oh.
One quick question here. Some Orientalists claim Muslims do not make unique contribution to philosophy, only fine-tuned existing Greeks' world. What unique contribution have Muslims made to philosophy?
I mean, honestly, a lot of the work in the realm of science and religion, or reason and religion, philosophy and religion, this was actually very unique to Muslims, because Christians weren't engaged in that. There was no room for Christians to engage in that. And Judaism had a lot of that scholarship also, but that there wasn't a lot of that sort of made contact with the Muslim scholars. So a lot of those contributions are very unique in the field of, I guess, philosophical theology. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'll be quick. Jazakallah khairan. This was my first real exposure to philosophy and also Islamic philosophy. So it was very interesting to learn. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome.
The question I have is if you have any recommendations for further reading or resources that somebody can look into to dive deeper into this topic or to gain some more exposure.
Yeah, so philosophy generally or Islamic philosophy?
Either
Either
or.
one?
Yeah.
So honestly, I know this is going to sound weird, but there's maybe some of you are familiar with the Crash Course series on YouTube. They do like Crash Course History and Crash Course Economics. There is a Crash Course Philosophy, and I think it's a series of videos, maybe 30 plus, and each video is about 10 minutes long, and it just gives you a glimpse of philosophy. What I like about it is it's pretty diverse in its presentation, so they include not just Western philosophy, but other philosophers as well. And it's a good, just overarching intro to like some of the topics that people discuss in philosophy, the debates that have happened, and then the history and major philosophers. So I think that's actually a good place to start, even though it seems silly like YouTube videos. And then there's this book called The Big Book of Philosophy, which does something similar, introduces in a very basic way. And then I can show you a couple books that I brought that might be interesting. Yeah.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح